There are many days that I wish I could go back in time and relive the moments of my childhood. There are so many questions that I have about conversations that I remember. And as a child, I only get the children's version of each story. I wish that I could hear the adult version. I vividly remember the times that I heard my grandfather speak from behind the pulpit, and many of those statements were recorded for all to hear. But my grandfather also had a very private life, which looked much different from the public version. There were stories about the prophet that he told in public, but there were also memories that he shared with our family about the prophet and his family in private. I remember riding with my grandfather and my father on a road trip deep into Kentucky when my grandpa told one of his favorite jokes about a football player. I remember it like it was yesterday. Grandpa saying, "Calhoun say he don't want that ball," then laughing until his sides hurt. This was from a recording of what my grandfather said was the prophet's favorite comedian. It was called Laughing With Him. My grandpa called it the White Negro. It was a recording of a Baptist minister telling jokes involving situations with African Americans in the Mississippi Delta. Grandpa had a cassette tape which was copied from the record, and several friends also had copies. I learned later that the recording was made in 1971, 6 years after William Branham's death, and that would have not been this exact recording that Branham had heard. Still, as my research turned towards white supremacy, this was very troubling. I had never thought about that recording as being racist, and I'd never even thought about how the title itself would have been considered racial profiling. These jokes were poking fun at the African American culture, laughing with them. And though it seemed harmless enough, I know now just how wrong this was. We never gave it a second thought while in the message. If this kind of humor was loved by the prophet, then it must not be sinful. When I learned that the Kardashian family was involved with the early stages of the healing revival, and that they were sponsoring faith healers, Avak Hagopian and William Branham, I wanted to know why. How did the Los Angeles elite hear about an Indiana preacher? Why did they choose to sponsor him above all the other faith healers of the era? In the photograph of William Branham standing in an expensive white suit with Avak Hagopian, there was a third man standing. Who was this man in the photo with William Branham and Avak Hagopian? Learning that Tatos Kardashian also sponsored white supremacist Clem Davies was the key to opening many doors of research. Davies published books on British Israelism and taught Christian identity doctrine. These ideologies were strongly anti-Semitic and promoted by the Ku Klux Klan. This type of theology is used to promote a racial interpretation of Christianity, usually by white supremacists, and by comparison, William Branham's serpent seed doctrine was no different. I found it interesting that Davies was in Los Angeles at the same time as Roy E. Davis, and that Davies had organized Avak's tour through 34 states and 3 Canadian provinces starting October 13, 1947. This was about the same time that William Branham's faith-healing career was launched into full steam. I began to wonder, was Clem Davies a member of the Ku Klux Klan? Would Davies have been aligned with Americanization and the white supremacy agendas of Roy E. Davis? Clem Davies earned his fame in Victoria, British Columbia in the early 1920s. He was a pastor of the Centennial Church, and in the early 1920s, he was quite popular. His sermons were unlike those of other preachers of the time. Davies made his sermons appealing for those who were tired of the traditional sermon. Similar to William Branham's message doctrine, Clem Davies' version of Christianity was militant and opposed to organized religion. It was also very popular. In fact, it was so popular that his congregation grew until his small church overflowed and filled the Victoria City Temple. In the Victoria City Temple, his sermons continued to stray even further from the ordinary. They began to include discussions on sex, race, and bloodline. They also included the fundamental elements of his Christian identity doctrine, which was similar to William Branham's serpent seed theology. Clem Davies' sermons had to be censored, and at times, children under 16 were forbidden. Davies was deeply involved with white supremacy and the Ku Klux Klan, and the Klan agenda made its way into his sermons. In 1924, he threatened that the Ku Klux Klan would become militant if the Oriental problem was not stopped. In 1925, he began preaching about joining the Ku Klux Klan, apparently holding membership drives. There was no question that Davies was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He openly declared his allegiance. Clem Davies was a prominent lecturer as well as a preacher and a Klansman. He gave public speeches concerning British Israelism, which gained an even more diverse crowd. British Israelism is the pseudo-archaeological notion that the people of the British Isles are genetically, racially, and linguistically the direct descendants of the 10 lost tribes of ancient Israel from the Christian Bible. Reverend Gordon Lindsay, Branham's campaign manager, was also active in Davies' British Israelism and spoke during public conventions. In the late 1940s, Davies began working with the Kardashians to support Avak Hagopian and William Branham. Coincidentally, this was during the time that Roy E. Davis and William D. Upshaw were in Los Angeles, preparing for what would later become the third wave of the Ku Klux Klan. As I began to study the ministry of Clem Davies, it brought back several painful memories. We were taught to believe the prophet had a revelation about Russian invasion. We believed that women voting would cause the destruction of the United States at the hand of Russia. I was shocked to see that this was a popular notion among white supremacists of the 40s and 50s. They were weaponizing religion to use fear for political agenda, and their sermons were not simply religious. They were politically motivated. Even the prophet's use of the Giza Pyramid was popular among white supremacy groups. This was a subject Clem Davies also discussed during lectures. One advertisement suggested that Davies and his peers used pyramid dates to predict world disaster. Davies also organized and sold tickets for speaking engagements on cruises, touring countries such as Cuba and the South Pacific. I began to think about William Branham's trips with the Christian Businessmen group. I had always pictured a very humble, very spiritual trip to save the lost. I never thought about William Branham and his associates taking glorious holidays and cruises, and I always assumed that his audience were native converts. I never even considered the possibility of the group selling tickets for vacations with the evangelists. We were never told this part of the prophet's life story. We were never told about the key individuals who were behind the revivals, and we were certainly never told that they were involved with white supremacy. By 1948, countless ministers and evangelists had joined in the revival, many of them with the gift of healing. As new faith healers joined in the revival, William Branham began to advertise their ministries in his Voice of Healing publication. Issues of the Voice of Healing were now representing several men of God with special sign-gift ministries. The message I'd heard was always scornful towards other healers. We called them carnal impersonators. But in 1948, William Branham ran the newsletter, and subscribers sent him letters that he would read, answer, and sometimes publish. I began to understand why the prophet said that he had boxes of testimonies, though we weren't allowed to see any of them. I was surprised when I noticed that the prophet also authored several articles in the Voice of Healing, and I was surprised by how articulate he was. I continued to wonder what year he began claiming to have only a 6th grade education. His writing skills in 1948 were very good. He also published articles written by Gordon Lindsay that were allegedly prophetic. Following Davies' strategy, Lindsay continued to tout themes of fear about impending invasion or world disaster, and presented his own doomsday predictions. Using random number associations between the Bible and modern events, Lindsay warned readers to prepare for Armageddon. I never realized how often we were subjected to the same type of fear. As I searched through the transcripts, I realized that William Branham often used this strategy for his own doomsday predictions. In May of 1954, William Branham used number association for the alleged doomsday year of 1954. In the month of 1962, the prophet used fear to claim that there was only a month or so remaining. He said, "In a month or so she'll be gone, and as soon as she's gathered together, well, we're at the end." Even his 1977 doomsday prediction, for which he would be remembered, was based on random number association. I was very surprised to see that William Branham had been using themes of fear and world destruction since 1948. Clem Davies and those who held similar views on British Israelites were claiming that the fuse to Armageddon had already been lit. It was evident that Branham held no exception to this common theme, and that he was using the same fear tactics to captivate his own audience. The Red Scare was an effective way to draw crowds. People feared the unknown, and these religious entertainers were presenting an escape from that fear, all while channeling it down to create even more fear. Sermons were focused upon Armageddon, and biblical prophecy was rewritten to apply to modern events. Davies took this approach to extremes, using screen illustrations to display his doomsday predictions. As strange as it might sound, crowds were eager to learn more about their impending doom, and he continued to gain attention. The sudden surge of faith healers, prophecy, and doomsday predictions caught the attention of a group of men in Battleford, Saskatchewan. They had visited the revivals in Vancouver, BC, and created the formula for a new breed of Pentecostalism. A revival broke out at the Sharon Orphanage, and it spread throughout the ranks of divine healers in the United States and Canada. It would become known as the Latter Rain, and would remain controversial for years to come.